I'm John Ross-Barnard. I was formerly the Managing Director cum Chief Executive of Coventry Cable Television. I came to Cable and Coventry in 1984, and I stayed here for precisely 3 days and 3 years. 3 years and 3 days to the day I worked in Coventry and then went back to London. But still live in Coventry and very happy I am here.
And over that time we understand that you had some interaction with the Coventry Evening Telegraph. Would you like to explain what that interaction was?
When I came to Coventry, the Coventry Evening Telegraph was the most important outlet, if you like, media outlet in the city. There was also Mercia Sound Radio, which had been there only about 5 years itself. And, you know, radio, commercial radio was new. And then along came this idea, Margaret Thatcher's idea actually, for cable television. And she'd seen the model operating in America and thought it could be an independent approach to news that doesn't or didn't exist then. If you think of how Donald Trump regards the media now, Margaret Thatcher was ahead of her time. She regarded the media with absolute contempt. So therefore, when I arrived here, I saw the reaction to me as being one of cautious friendliness. It was a period of enormous change. It looked towards technology, I suppose. Technology itself was the fundamental driver. If you think that every man who worked in an office had a secretary, only journalists could type. Nobody else but journalists would type and have shorthand. That was the amazing difference. The only male group that could type and take shorthand were male journalists.
And who did you interact with when you went into the building for these meetings? So did you get the opportunity to meet many journalists?
No, I didn't. I looked across the print room to see what must have been 30, 40, 50 maybe bent heads typing, and of course old-fashioned typing, heavy 20-pound pressure on each key. It was a tremendous sound. Just think of a single typewriter, and that's hard to do now because who hears a typewriter? But if you can imagine a typewriter and then multiply it up by 20 or so times, it was a constant clack, 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 clack. Plus, over the top of it, journalists shouting down telephones.
And the people that you had a meeting with, can you describe who those people were and where that meeting took place?
They were people who really wanted to know what, if anything, cable television would have as an impact on their business. They saw news as their domain, if you like. Nobody else could do news, but surely newspapers and maybe the BBC. They didn't know what social media was. They couldn't have imagined social media. They couldn't have imagined that people would have control over their own news gathering and news distribution. And that was what was happening in the future. You couldn't tell them because they wouldn't understand it. That sounds very patronizing. I don't mean that. But the fact is, they did not have a vision of the future. And that's why newspapers continued to drop in popularity. What the effect of television advertising, affordable television advertising, would have on newspaper revenue. That was their key concern.
Just going back to that first time you came into the building itself, because obviously the building has got such a huge importance within this particular project that we're looking at just at the moment. Can you describe how you felt walking into that building for the first time and the spaces that you interacted with when you were there?
Oh, envy, huge envy. The number of staff, the busyness, the noise, the function of it, the importance of it in the city. This little cable television operation, which perhaps one day would become enormous. No, it was nothing but envy and admiration for what they achieved.
Behind closed doors in these board meetings, do you think the other staff, as in reporters and printers and everyone else involved in the building, had any awareness of what was happening in these conversations behind closed doors?
To set Coventry in context, the thing that was driving Coventry, and indeed driving the West Midlands, was industrial unrest. Strike after strike after strike. There's a very famous shop steward called Red Robbo, based at Longbridge in Birmingham, whose impact was enormous on industry, because he, by just saying everybody out, which was almost a joke, that line, everybody out, he could bring to a complete halt not one car company, but the whole of the motor industry throughout Birmingham and the Midlands. So in the print industry, Murdoch was doing the same thing. Murdoch was determined to adopt new practices. He'd bought the Sun. He was determined that it would be such a profit-making, inexpensive means of news distribution that others in local newspapers were looking at it in absolute awe. How could this possibly happen? It was really the coming together of all the famous names under the heading of British Leyland. All of the companies, you know, Morris, Austin, Rover, Elf. I mean, so that, you know, there were probably maybe 60 different car manufacturing names, each with their own badge. And as they went out of business, so they kept the names and made the same car with a different badge in fewer and fewer factories.
Was there an impact on employment?
Oh yes, yes. It dropped and dropped and dropped. I think everybody watching this will know that Longbridge, as it was the centre of the motor manufacturing industry, just died. You were watching the slow death of an industry. And unfortunately, it wasn't that slow. Suddenly, all of a sudden, it sped up. And people were saying, how could this possibly happen? I remember a man coming to me for a job, and he said, I want a stable job. I want a job that I'm not going to be made redundant in. Can you say that about cable television? And the chap I was with said, there's only one stable role, and that's to go on the dole. And that terrible, terrible cynicism, to me, sort of sounded out what it was like to be a worker at that time, living in fear of a job. We were lucky, we were on the bright side, weren't we? If you'd been working, for example, for Thames Television in London, a film crew was 12 people demanded by the union, the ACTT of its time. You couldn't step a foot outside the door without another 11 people following you to wherever you were going. That was the amount of corruption which existed in the television industry then. And along came cable, if you like, blessed by Margaret Thatcher. I had cable operators with just 2 people, one on sound, one on vision. Doesn't sound unreasonable today. I recall the managing director of ATV at a Royal Television Society dinner. He said, John Ross-Barnard, I want to welcome you to Birmingham to present some of the television that we would like to present, but we can't afford it. However, he said, I don't wish you too warm a welcome. We represented a threat. I mean, overall, it was about as civil as Prime Minister's question time on a Wednesday in the House of Parliament. Teeth were ground. Meanings were, as it were, carefully mulled over before being expressed.
And so in terms of if you had the ability to put something in this space for a period of time for people to look at and engage with now, what are the subjects or what are the topics that you think would be the strongest things for you to explore in that project? Noise.
I mean, if we're sort of recreating it as tableau, for want of a better word, then noise and dirt and typing and people running about with bits of paper. rushing. Everything was to a news agenda. Of course, because you had print time and you had to get the edition out for its print time.
And talking about the differences between male and female teams and stuff, did you feel that at the top? So in these board meetings, was there any female representation in these meetings?
I think about 10% in the 80s. I see today they're proud of the fact that they've managed to get 42% at the top echelon of the Coventry Telegraph. They're moving in the right direction.
And in terms of where we are now, where do you see the Coventry Evening Telegraph in their importance in this journey? Do you think they still have a resonance with the people of the city?
Oh yes, I do, but only to 10%. I come back to the point that when it started, if you like, or even just after the war in the 50s, they were selling 300,000 copies a night. Then it had dropped to 100,000, then by the 1980s, and it's now down to 18,000. I think all news we're becoming inured to, quite frankly. Pick up the newspaper and it says 10,000 people die in a bomb in Kabul, and you go, oh yeah, what's next? That is the most terrible contempt that we have for the price of life. It's worth saying that across the road here was a very famous editor, Geoffrey Elliott. He was no friend. He prided himself that he was no friend to anybody. He would write astonishing stuff about the council, about the police, and so on. And he became really a very highly regarded journalist. So regarded that in last year's Queen's Honours List, he was made Commander of the British Empire. He was very interesting, only because he, I believe, could clearly see what was happening in the future. I have a memory that he had a column called Peeping Tom, in which he would find interesting stories about the burghers of Coventry. So certainly, whenever I went to the council house, for example, they didn't hesitate to say what they thought of Geoffrey Elliott. The police similarly, because he would point out the failings. You know, that's their job of journalists, to point out the failings in society. And when he did it, obviously they didn't like it.